I'm Lawrence Krauss, and welcome to the Origins Podcast. This week, my guest is Peter Boghossian, a philosopher who was at Portland State University. Peter's a fascinating individual in many ways. I've known him for a number of years. He actually began his work working with inmates at a correctional facility, trying to think about ways to use critical thinking to improve moral reasoning. And thinking about things critically has really been a central part of his career. He's been active in areas of atheism. In fact, he wrote a book called A Manual to Great Atheists, but also really been involved in getting people to question their own ideas, and wrote another book with James Lindsay on how to have impossible conversations. He gained a lot of notoriety when he and Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose wrote a series of spoof papers designed to challenge the scholarship in gender studies areas, which he felt was less than optimal, let me say. And that created a big controversy. And he most recently got a great deal of attention for resigning from his position at Portland State University because of concerns about free speech and open inquiry at the university. He has pioneered something called street epistemology, which is getting people on the street or in classrooms to try techniques to question their own ideas and potentially change their minds, which of course is always difficult and fascinating. We talked about all of these things and more during our conversation. I think you'll find it really quite interesting. You can watch it, of course, without advertisements on our Substack site, Critical Mass, or you can watch it on our YouTube channel. Either way, I hope if you watch it, you'll consider subscribing to our Substack site, because those subscriptions help support the Origins Project Foundation, which supports the podcast. That nonprofit foundation supports the podcast and also all the other activities of the foundation, the public events and travel experiences. Of course, if you can also listen to it on any podcast site for free as well. No matter how you watch it or listen to it, I certainly hope you'll enjoy this podcast with Peter Boghossian. Well, Peter Boghossian, thanks for being here virtually with me, although we're across the continent from each other. It's always good to see you.
Thanks. It's really, really good to see you too.
And we're going to go all over the map, I think, which is what we usually do when we have conversations together in private. So we'll do that in public. But I want to start. It occurred to me as I was preparing this, and as you know, I prepare incredibly, that I've never asked you this question that I can recall in our personal conversations. But because this is an Origins podcast, I like to find out people's origins. And I know nothing about your origins. I don't know what your mother and father did. What do your mother and father do?
Oh, my mother and father are deceased now. Unfortunately, I miss them terribly.
Same with me.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Something that you never. It's just. Yeah. My dad was a civil engineer, and he was always very, very good with math, very proficient with math. And my mom was a manager of medical offices.
Oh, okay. So you decided, obviously, you wanted to become an academic of sorts, although you became a philosopher. But there's, we excuse you for that. But
I'm down on philosophy, and I think we should talk about that.
I'd love to talk about that. But who encouraged your? Presumably that came from an interest in reading or something else. So who did either of them encourage you to go in a certain direction? Your father want you to be an engineer or a scientist or anything like that, or
no? They just gave me the freedom to do whatever I wanted to do. I was and I always wanted to do the most intense things. I did stick and knife fighting for years. I did.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, I did philosophy, but even in philosophy, I was always fascinated by the God question, because it seemed at the time, this is the most profound. Turns out it's not profound. It's not sophisticated. It's rather silly and sophomoric. So there's really nothing to it.
Yeah.
So I always wanted that experience of throwing myself as deeply as possible in something that I consider to be, as Dennett says, of abiding significance.
Oh, wow. Okay. So does that mean, did that, as you say, you knife fighting and other things, but did
my hands are all cut up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How soon did that, so it didn't always relate to sort of scholarly or academic things. It was anything that you thought was intense and important. What I'm
Yeah.
wondering is, did you read a lot? I mean, when did you decide that sort of an academic career would be, or did you just fall into it?
Uh, I was always captivated by Plato and captivated by, well, just the dialogues of Socrates were just,
Sure.
I don't know, they were really just so wondrous. They were so magical, although that's not exactly the right word.
Well,
And then the more I started reading the history of Western intellectual thought in particular, the more enamored I became and the more fascinated I became with people trying to figure stuff out. What I didn't realize, and if this is too abrupt of a segue, is let me know.
mhm.
What I didn't realize then, that I slowly came to realize and then became horrified by, is that you can't figure out problems just by thinking about them. Like, you need some kind of empirical, you need some kind of data. And philosophers, as a rule, they're just not trained to do that. They're not trained to look at methods. They're not trained to look at data collection and analysis. They're not trained in science at all. They're not trained in this, they may be trained in the Socratic method, although now I highly doubt it, but they're not trained in the scientific method. So they don't have those tools available to them. And when you don't have those tools available to you, then your speculations are, not only are they untethered to reality, but when you're really good at coming up with arguments and making inferences and analysis, etc., then you inflate your confidence in your speculations, and sooner or later kind of come to believe it's true as you place yourself in a community with other people who have adopted similar conclusions.
Well, look, I can't agree with you more. I mean, I think that's the whole point of my concern to some extent, not just about philosophy, but about revelation generally. You don't. I would argue no knowledge comes except from observing and testing. There's no knowledge that comes. Wisdom may come, but there's no knowledge that comes from just pure thought, I think, and without any connection to the empirical world. And we can go on about that, and I think we will now and later. But I want to ask,
Yeah.
in that regard, I mean, what you've come to recognize is obviously the importance of the scientific method, but you argue that's kind of recent. Did you never have a flirtation with science at all, or was it math that was a problem, or
Oh,
did you
no,
just?
no, I did have a flirtation with science. I used to teach science and pseudoscience, which I love.
Yeah.
No, I always had a flirtation with science, but what I didn't, I just didn't understand that, like it's complicated.
Well,
So,
let's step back a little. You're talking about your professional career. I want to go back earlier. When you were
yeah.
younger, did you ever think of? I mean, when you were in school, was science of interest to you? I mean, like public school and primary school or high school.
Yeah, it was. I don't think I received the best education until I was in high school, and then I went to a private high school, and I got a Jesuit high school, made me the man I am today. Uh,
Yeah. Well, a lot of people have not only survived but thrived from that education. But
yeah, it's true. But I was interested in science. It was, to a certain extent, you're right, the math, it kept me back. But it just wasn't my passion. My passion was, I've always been curious about why people believe things, and I find beliefs fascinating, and I find education really interesting. And education is a way to help people refine what it is that they believe, and to calibrate their confidence in the belief to the evidence they have or the reasoning they have for it. So I ended up in the perfect career, in a sense. That was before the madness took over. But
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I was intrigued also. Speaking of it, it's a good segue about which we're almost at. I didn't realize what you would call your PhD is really an EdD. You have
Yeah.
your degree is in education, which I didn't realize. But let's
Yeah.
let's talk about how you got there. What was your undergraduate degree in?
My undergraduate degree, what was it in? I have to think. Oh, it was in psychology.
It had a huge impact on you.
My undergraduate degree is in psychology with a minor in philosophy. My master's degree from Fordham was in philosophy. I was in a PhD program in philosophy, and they threw me out. And then that's a long
Oh,
story. And then I went to a the ed doc program because I did my dissertation in the prisons,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I worked, yeah, I work with prison and go ahead.
Well, no, I mean the title of your thesis was Socratic reasoning, critical theory, moral reasoning, and
Critical
inmate
thinking.
education. Critical thinking, sorry,
Big
not critical
difference.
theory. Sorry, that's a big difference.
That'll
Critical,
make them worse.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Critical thinking and moral
Worse to
reasoning
no
in
harm.
inmate
Yeah.
education. No, so I
Yeah.
mean your early fascination with Socratic reasoning and education are both there. In fact, and so why don't you talk about
Yeah.
that PhD a little bit, or that whatever you call it,
Yeah.
ND.
I okay. I had the idea a long time ago from my dad. You mentioned my dad. He was a civil
Mm.
engineer. We were hiking one day, and we were at a filthy stream, and we came to a filthy stream, and I said, "Wow, how do you get that out?" And he explained to me that there are various methods of taking pollution out of a stream. One is called primary cleaning, where you basically dump bales of hay in, and it will get out 80%. I think that's what he said of the particulates as many years ago,
Hmm.
and the pollution. But if you want to get the water cleaner than that, you have to. He said the best way to clean up the stream is to not. This conversation affected my whole intellectual life. The best way to clean up the stream is to just stop polluting it. But if you want it really clean, then you're going to need, I think he called it primary cleaning, and that's a machine, that's electricity, that's industrial, and the cleaner you want the water, um, the more cost prohibitive it becomes. And so at the time I was lifting a lot of weights because I was pretty serious about my about martial arts. And then I realized that same principle was operative when you were lifting weights. Like if you were bench pressing, from 9 to 10 is more difficult than 1 to 9.
Hmm.
And then I wondered if that principle were operative in other arenas and other domains. And I wondered if the same thing could be you could do the same thing cognitively. Like I wonder if you could just throw a bale of hay in people's cognitive structures or their epistemic lives and just clean it up, not to get it to 100, but just good enough. And so um and so I thought, well, whose cognitive or epistemic structures are damaged? And then I started thinking, like, who are the most vulnerable? And then I thought, well, prison inmates. And then I thought, well, geez, I wonder if you could give prison inmates just enough tools to help them desist from crime. Not all of them, but
Yeah.
just enough. But it would have to be something that was cheap and that they can do with themselves. The highest form of the Socratic method is when you implement it on yourself, when you do it to yourself. So, long story short, so I developed a program in which I pulled germane questions from the history of Western intellectual thought. What is it to be a man? What is justice? Is one type of life better to lead than another? And I explored these questions in Socratic format with men. They were all males at the time, but Columbia River Correction Institution. And then I designed. So that was basic. I can talk about the study design, but anyway, but that was the basic idea. And then I ideally you'd want to do that again. Science, you'd want to test outcomes, and you'd want to. So that was the basic idea of my dissertation.
Yeah, I
And
know
then
it.
yeah,
Well, I mean, I was going to say when I read your dissertation, I thought, well, I think of you as a person in some ways who likes to think about how to get people to change their minds or in one way or another, and convincing people to potentially get rid of false
I can't
ideas.
believe you read my dissertation. Holy shit, you're like, that's amazing to me.
Well, no, I would like you to think I read the whole thing, but I just read enough to, like many
I'll
cases,
take the
I read
first
enough to
page. Good
sound
enough.
good. Yeah, but the purpose, the purpose of it to decrease criminal behavior, I thought was interesting, and the use of the Socratic method, which seems to me permeates in many ways. If I tried to think of themes of for what I know of you personally, and then of what I
Yeah.
know of you professionally. But the use of Socratic method certainly continues throughout much of a great deal of your work,
and the
Yeah,
fact that it was important
yeah,
early on is neat. But I was going to ask, as a scientist, about
yeah.
the outcomes. Did you actually ever did I mean, you did this, but in philosophy probably that's all you had to do. But did you ever were there any evidence that your discussions with inmates did have
Yeah,
an
that,
impact?
that that's a great question. Yeah, so it was evaluated by the short answer is no, but and the reason for that is because I couldn't get IRB approval to
Yeah.
track
Hmm.
the men, because they were men, all men,
Yeah.
to track the men after they left the facility. It was a pre-release facility, so they were there for like 9 months or a year. I couldn't get approval to do that, so I didn't have access to
Yeah,
that
sure.
data,
Yeah, yeah.
because prison inmates are protected. But I looked at it in other ways with other metrics. I actually ran into two of the guys. I ran into one of the guys when I was on vacation in Seaside a few years ago. But I could tell you what he said, but that's just anecdotal. But it was really positive.
Well, that's good.
But that so then I used that basic idea, and I just want to refine something. It's not persuading anybody to do anything. It's just giving people the tools to ask themselves better questions so that they can figure things out. Another way to think about it is giving people the gift of doubt.
Hmm.
So then I threw myself at another problem using the same tool set, which is religion.
Did you read my notes? I mean, come on. I'm segueing from saying convincing
Oh,
inmates to bat. No, it's amazing, because that's
oh,
exactly it seemed to me you progressed from people who had clearly had some problems
right,
thinking about the world, and it caused them to be in jail, to
right.
other people who were deluded, and you moved directly. It was a natural sort of segue,
A hundred
both in this
exactly.
conversation, to religious people, and then you went in that with a furor, right? The idea
Oh
that
yeah,
it's besides a manual for atheists, the idea not just a question of how to convince people to think, that who are deluded, to potentially ask themselves enough questions to overcome that, but also you began to state outright. I mean, not just ask questions. You made strong statements that faith is a what would you call it? An unreliable epistemology.
correct.
That it's, and of course it is. It's a considering faith as a way of knowing is the biggest mistake of all, because there's no faith doesn't give you any knowledge about anything. No, independent of whether it's religious faith, right?
Yeah. So thinking about faith in terms of an epistemology was key.
Mm.
Can it be relied upon? Can a similar person use the same reasoning to come to a different conclusion? How would they evaluate their conclusion? But again, I want to really stress it's not persuading, it's not
No.
convincing. I've never tried to convince anybody, really. I've just asked targeted questions. And I found, so this is really interesting. So I found that overall Christians love to engage those questions.
Hmm.
I'd go to talks, would go out afterwards for drinks and beers and hang out, and I'd had some very, very spiritual long hours of the morning. I've friends with many Christians. They disagree with me and they're very honest about it, but they never shied away from discussion or conversation. I don't want to say debate, because that's not what this is. Almost the exact opposite of what this is. You're not vested in winning. In fact, in the Gorgias, Plato says it, or Socrates says, basically you if you win, you're the loser. If someone changes your mind, then you're the winner, because you get to discard a false belief.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really, and in fact, I made a note when you talk about that elsewhere. That, I mean, that to me, that's one of the biggest, most convincing arguments in favor of free speech that I first really heard explained very coherently by Christopher Hitchens, who said the real losers when you impede free speech are not the people whose speech you're impeding, it's yourself, because you don't have the opportunity to find out you might be wrong, and
Correct.
so you're harming yourself as much as anyone else, which is what's so sad about this fixation of stopping people from talking now. And we'll get to that, this woke
Right.
idea that
Right.
somehow
Which is
free
Kant's
speech can harm
idea.
you. Yeah,
Right.
the notion that something you don't agree with can harm you is just is
Yeah.
is
Or that it's
unfortunate.
violence. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the fact that it's violence is delusional, but the fact that it can
So
harm you is.
yeah. So then okay.
But let
So
me say,
go
you're
ahead.
not interested in. It's intriguing to me. It's clear from, as you know, your next book, which we'll talk about at some point, impossible have impossible conversations. The idea is actually to have a conversation. Yet the
Yeah.
title for your first book was a manual for creating atheists. That sounds to me like you're interested in convincing and not so much in having.
Yeah, that was, I wanted to that was not my idea for the title. That was the publishers.
They always screw it up, don't they?
Yeah, I wanted to make the title Street Epistemology, and he told me that if you put the word epistemology in the title, forget sales. No one's ever going to buy it.
Yeah,
probably true.
Probably true. I'll buy that. But it certainly sounds like the idea is to convince people, and that wasn't its intent. It's to have conversations,
in the book, it's pretty clear that's not the intent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, I think that's what I view science is all about too. Is it's really confronting your own misconceptions.
Correct.
In fact, there's a great deal of, and you have this education degree, so you may know this more than me, but I know, having looked at education and physics, there's a great deal of evidence and data suggesting the only way people learn anything is confronting their own misconceptions, which is one of the reasons.
Well, that's what it means to that's what it means to learn. If you didn't confront your own misconceptions, you'd just be parroting something back.
Exactly. People write things on the.
Yeah, you wouldn't have had justified belief. You would have just gotten lucky.
Well, it's not even that. You don't even remember it. What
do you mean?
Well, I'll give you an example. One of the great things about physics is people have lots of misconceptions, so you can use them, and that's why I've used science fiction too, like Star Trek. Because there's so many.
I'm a huge fan. I loved your book, by the way. Yeah.
But thanks. But I'll give you an example. So once I'm going to try and talk less and listen more, but as one of the recommendations of your book. But I'll give you that example. So I was once actually speaking for a lot of sort of leaders of the free world, and it was about nonsense. Actually, I was talking about the value of nonsense, but I gave the example of Galileo, and I took a piece of paper and a book, and I dropped them, and I was about to drop them. I said, which will drop first? And these were, as I say, significant individuals who were political leaders, and they all said the book's going to go fall first. I dropped it, sure. Then I said, why? And of course, and what is amazing, or maybe not so amazing, is a lot of them, of course, parroted the fact that, well, the book's heavier. Okay. Right. But they had all learned in school that wasn't the case. They'd all got taken, some physics somewhere that, Galileo said all things fall at the same rate. But they wrote that down, and it didn't. So what I did is, I actually took a line from Galileo, the modern version, and this, a lot of people do this demonstration in class. I took the paper and curled it up into a ball, and that, which you can do, and then you drop it, and it falls at the same rate as the book. And I'm reasonably certain that when they saw that, they would remember the result because it confronted their own misconceptions instead of being told at a blackboard, Galileo said that all things fall at a constant rate. So that's what I mean by it. You remember, you internalize, you actually learned it by confronting your own misconception. When you learned it on the board and passed an exam by writing that down, you never really learned it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I guess you could look at that in terms of education. I've always believed that in philosophy you call it defeasibility, but in science you call it disconfirmation.
Or falsification.
Falsification is to give people a tool set. That's interesting. We could talk about the difference between those, but that's
I'd like to.
Pedantic. Yeah. So you want to give people a tool set in which that they can impose upon their thinking. But what's even more important than the tool set is to give them an attitude. This is something I used to do. I used to take an egg, and as long as they're not the thin eggs, if they have a reasonably thick shell, and I would, at the time when I taught, the windows could open, and then I would take the egg and hover it out the window, and I'd say, well, what would happen when I drop this egg? And you have to make sure that you drop it on grass. You can't
on good grass. On good grass.
You can't drop it on cement, or it won't work. And and everybody looked at me as if I were insane. And I said, well, just articulate what would happen. And they say it will break. But when you actually do that, the egg does not break.
It bounces on it.
Yeah, Buckminster Fuller designed the geodesic domes. But the purpose of that is to not, and I published a piece about this a few years ago, the purpose of that is not to induce complexity in people, which I think is an important distinction. It's to show people that a belief that they had is incorrect, and how to test that belief. And what I think is really important, two things, is the attitudinal disposition that someone has, the idea that they should want to change their mind, the idea that that's a good thing, and they have reliable mechanisms to do so. But I just turned 56, and I can tell you now, from a lifetime of scholarship and study and writing about these issues, I am now convinced that the most important, the most significant, demonstrably significant way for people to change their minds is for them to think that it's a moral virtue to do so. Once people think that something's a moral virtue, it's very difficult to disabuse them of things. So if we can convince people that certain things, certain epistemological considerations are morally virtuous to do, like to engage ideas, to have free speech, because it's not enough that, like, you're right, it's not enough that they just memorize something, or that they can go through rote and give it back on an exam, but they have to be not only open and willing to change their mind, but they have to think it's a good thing, it's a virtue.
That's a fascinating. That's a fascinating idea, and it really resonates. Again, we could jump. That'll cause us to jump to something that's much. I think hopefully we'll talk about more later in the conversation, but that is part of the problem with modern higher education, is that people are taught precisely the opposite.
That's 100% correct.
Not to change your.
That's correct. And professors go into the classroom being convinced that they have the right answers to moral questions, testing, in which they don't, testing people on those questions, getting back the right answer. So there's kind of a filtration system, and that's also penetrated journals, upper tier journals, less so in the sciences, although now it's more with just the University of Tennessee or Knoxville, someplace has diversity, increasing number of schools, the diversity requirements. But we can get that, we can get to that in a minute. But the idea is then it's been institutionalized not to do that, to not change your mind, to know the right answers to the questions, to say the right things, to parrot the right things back. And then you're rewarded by publishing in journals who only accept certain articles that forward those narratives. And then you're rewarded in terms of promotion and tenure. And then, so basically I know that this must, some of your listeners thinking, holy shit, this is super. Oh, I shouldn't have sworn. Can I swear on the podcast? I don't know.
Yeah, you can.
This is sounding.
We'll just have to put a label.
All right, we'll just bleep it out. So let's go back. Like, holy moly. This is sounding really postmodernist. I didn't know that Boghossian was a postmodernist. I'm not a postmodernist. I'm saying that this is a way that what people it's an explanatory mechanisms for how organizations and institutions become ideologically captured.
Okay, now that's interesting to me, because we're segueing, but let's segue.
Okay, well,
no. You raised an interesting point, and I want to follow with it rather than take you somewhere else for the moment. But you're suggesting that the cause, to some extent, of the problems in universities originates with the faculty, and that's intriguing to me, because I see it as originating from entitled children who
it's multi-causal.
And I see it encouraged by faculty and emboldened by faculty and enabled by faculty who are hesitant to say, hey, you're just being childish.
It's multi-causal. It's colleges of education, which almost nobody talks about. I just released something on my YouTube channel from Lyle Asher from Lewis and Clark, who just gives singularly the best explanation you've ever heard for how this happened. It's grievance studies departments. I mean, it's cultural tides. There are so many factors at play. You can't just single out one and say that's causally responsible.
I guess so. I certainly will get to grievance studies. I also wasn't going to say this, but it was interesting to me to have an education doctor, because indeed I got involved with the College of Education. I'd avoided a few places, but my last university I did for a while I was going to be involved with them and doing some grant proposals and programs, and then I realized that they don't have the slightest idea what education is all about.
It's a sewer. It's a woke cesspool. It's not even 20 years ago, 15 years ago, it wasn't a woke cesspool, but it was, again, an indoctrination mill. And so
it was the scholarship, the level of scholarship was just so
abysmal.
bad. It was just,
it's abysmal.
The whole point, and maybe I'd never seen this before in physics, I have to say, but I was involved in writing a big grant proposal to try and change the way potentially science teaching was taught or whatever. But it turned out that unless you reference the correct studies, unless you reference these studies, then that was the open door to be able to get in. And it wasn't saying, hold on, maybe we have to do something different. No way. It was really kind of enlightening for me.
Right. Well, that's how the ideology entrenches itself, right?
Yeah. No,
because those journals participate in a narrative. And you won't get papers published in those journals unless you participate in that narrative. And you won't get tenure unless you have published papers. Well, unless you have some exogenous characteristic or what have you.
But I have to say, I'm going to defend go
ahead.
Up till now, in any case, that's why science is important, not just because it helps the world, but because as a process and way of thinking.
Okay.
And it is, in my development as a physicist over 40 years, it was the exact opposite in some sense. Obviously, you became more prominent by changing people's minds rather than
pause.
Yeah.
Okay, pause. That's why two things are extremely important, and then I'd like to linger on these for a minute. One is that peer review must remain blind.
Mm-hmm.
If it is not blind, the whole system is compromised. If you just look at someone because they have, okay. The other thing is, are you familiar with citation justice?
Well, tell me. I mean, I don't know the terminology, but I bet I've heard about it. Go on.
So it's that authors forward the citations of people whose ancestors have been historically oppressed.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what I expected it was. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a reasonable person can make a reasonable inference from citation justice. So yeah, it goes by a few other names, but the process, well, the scientific method is, I don't know if perfect is the right word, but it's
like democracy. It may not be the best thing in the world, but it's compared to everything else, it works pretty. It works. And the point is, it works.
Yeah. The only way that you would know something better is that you would have to use the scientific method to figure out what it is. Like if I told you, I said, I have this little plant here, and this plant makes predictions, etc. Well, then you'd impose the scientific method on that to see if that did what. I mean, there is no other way to do it.
It is the only way. The scientific method is the only way of getting knowledge, I would argue. And maybe that sounds strong, and I know people get really angry at me sometimes when I say that. But there's certainly no knowledge ever comes from revelation. It's the only way. Empirical knowledge is the only kind of knowledge there is, I would argue. Do you?
Yeah. Disagree? Well, we can have that conversation. So we can have that conversation. We're going off in many directions.
Yeah,
I would argue that. Yeah, I would argue that the Socratic method is the only way to develop moral knowledge, because I do believe there's such a thing as a moral fact, and I think that built-in corrective mechanism that offers everyone the opportunity to weed out mistakes in their thinking. It's only found in the Socratic method.
But isn't the Socratic method, in some sense, subsumed in the scientific method? Namely, the easiest person to fool is yourself. Yeah. Is yourself, and so you constantly have to ask yourself questions. But isn't the Socratic method basically searching for empirical knowledge? I mean, I've read, I was looking at, several, one of the Socratic dialogues in your newest book, in your last book on possible conversations, and which took me back for a while, and because I used to read them. But it's really questioning someone and asking them, hold on, you have this belief, but isn't there evidence to the contrary? Isn't there evidence to the contrary? So it's really kind of, or can't you think of evidence? You said this, but didn't you just say that? Doesn't this contradict that? Isn't that evidence? So it's really evidentially based in a sense, I would argue. And it's kind of...
Yeah, I mean, it's definitionally based. In the Euthyphro, they talk about piety, and the Republic, they talk about justice and the laws. And but so yeah, I think it's in different domains, the Socratic method. So you're a physicist, so I'll throw this out to you.
Sure.
So many years ago, I was watching a little known show. I'm a science fiction fanatic.
Okay.
So I have watched literally, I honestly don't think, my wife tells me this is not something I should ever brag about, but I don't think you can name a show that I haven't watched in science fiction. Every day since I've been a kid, I've watched 30 minutes to 60 minutes of science fiction before I go to sleep at night. Like I have a,
anyway, but the whole podcast on that. But anyway,
yeah, and I love it. I could talk about that endlessly. But anyway, I was watching a show a long time ago, Gene Roddenberry's Earth Final Conflict. Really a terrible show, but one of the things that that was in it that was really interesting, they had this thing called the Synod, and the Synod were these race of advanced alien beings, and they were trying to figure something out. They're having a deliberation, and I remember watching that and thinking to myself, there is no way that an advanced alien species would have a deliberation like that. And then I started thinking to myself, okay, well, how would they deliberate? And then it just was a huge light bulb. Well, because I had been thinking about this for years before, but the way that they would deliberate would be they would just ask each other incredibly good questions and then have a language that facilitates that. So it would be a form of embedded Socratic. It would have those conversations would have I would argue, not a strict Socratic structure, because it would be like a skeleton that was fleshed out by other empirical sciences, psychology, etc. So they would ask themselves the best questions to try to falsify their hypotheses. And embedded within that, it would have positive epistemological ambitions. So I think that if there were, and we can talk about that because you know my position that there's no intelligent life.
We're gonna get to it. I promise you, we'll get to
intelligent life. If there were, then that's how they would have to communicate. I can't think of any other way unless they had. But anyway, I'll pause there.
Well, you know, I'm going to sound. I don't want to sing the praise. Well, that's how physics has always been done for me. Physics was done for me. I mean, a lot of people think it's done by people sitting alone in a room doing equations, and that's not the way. At least not my experience, because science is collaborative, maybe not cooperative. But it was done at the blackboard, and. In my case, it was, Shelley Glashow yelling at me saying you're an idiot or something. But it was, it was going back and forth and asking and trying to ask the right questions to push the next person forward and vice versa.
Right.
And that's when science is being done well. That's what science is all about. It's exactly that kind of. Now, the other thing that isn't part of what you said, and I think that's because you're a philosopher, is you're not just asking questions of each other, because you're bound to be deluded in the end. You're asking questions of nature too. If you locked all those people in a room, they'd come up with the craziest nonsense. If they could never look outside the window.
Yeah, that's Cass Sunstein has something like that. So I want to talk about that because that's so important. And so I published a piece in the Philosopher's Magazine. And this is it's a takeoff on chapter 8. I think it's chapter 8 of Shermer's Why People Believe Weird Things and Why do Smart People Believe Weird Things. Smart people believe weird things because they're better at rationalizing. They're better at coming up with good reasons for bad conclusions. Philosophers are trained in that. And this absolutely infuriated my colleagues when I published this, which I'll talk about in a second. Truly, they lost their minds. When you get groups of smart people together, and they don't tether their conclusions to reality, to an empirical reality, then they're not gatekeepers of reason. They're mouthpieces of the dominant moral orthodoxy. In this case, social justice, wokeism, etc. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen intellectual capture, because we have horsepower of, for example, people in philosophy departments who are externally motivated through promotion, tenure, et cetera, and their jobs, their livelihoods, to create really good arguments for totally asinine ideas. And that's one of the things we see happening. So I want to say one more thing. Instead of, the rules of where if someone published a piece that you didn't like, well, then you publish a piece refuting it. Ideally, it would be in the same journal, but that's of secondary consideration. You would publish. We no longer, in the new orthodoxy, we no longer play by those rules. So that's out. Instead, you threaten them, you bring them up on charges from the diversity office, you do all these other things that are not in alignment with the rules of engagement. But that's the basic idea of when you get that. That's why intellectual diversity, that's one of the many reasons why intellectual diversity is so important, because that Feynman quote that you said, the easiest person to fool is yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because that one of the problems, one of the bits of trouble I've gotten sometimes is when I say things and I put the word theologians and philosophers in the same sentence, and both get upset. But that was my first example of because the philosopher types I know are people that I who have an empirical bent. So we
like Dennett.
Yeah. But for me, it was a revelation to see. I was once on a panel back at Yale, the 100th anniversary of some lectureship, and I was with theologians. I was the only atheist, obviously, and I was shocked and amazed at how these people who were obviously intelligent but ignorant, but intelligent, could produce the most incredible epicycle within epicycle arguments to justify the reality of religious nonsense. And I was amazed at how well they did it, but they were able to produce these complex arguments to justify what something on the surface seems just nonsensical.
Yeah, philosophers do the same thing.
Yeah, I'd never seen that because I hadn't, except something I'd already discounted. I mean, when I taught at Yale, it was the height of deconstructionism, and
Yale's the worst of the worst at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I was up the physics was. It was a good allegory. Physics was up on the hill and science hill, and philosophy was down below. So it was, but we used to say, and I've written this, we used to laugh and smirk and feel smug and saying that virus will never infect science. And then now what's looking at what happened. We'll get there. Yeah. Okay. So I guess we've done enough. Your moving from inmates to religion was a sort of positive. I view two competing aspects of your activities. One are positive, which is to sort of promote things, and one is negative, not that you're negative, but to trying to dispel bad things.
Correct.
So trying to get attack religious falsehoods, or at least get people to think about them, is one area. But before we go to the sort of more negative, this book, How to Have a Possible Conversation, is really the epitome of how to be. I was trying to think of. I read it and I kept seeing all the things you do wrong. I kept saying, "Well, I do this wrong. I do that wrong." In fact, in every podcast, I probably, even though those aren't impossible conversations, I keep noticing in my podcast all the things I'm violating in your rules. We'll talk, because I want to talk about your rules, but it seemed to me that if I were going to characterize at least a fair fraction of that book, it would be just be gracious, kind, and generous, and which is what my wife tells me all the time as a way to try to be better. And it seems to me in a conversation that does encompass a lot of the rules. You have different levels. You have fundamentals, beginners, advanced, and I don't want to go into all that unless we could do a whole podcast on that. But you do start the book by saying beliefs can change, and I want you to give me, well, of course, but what's your evidence for that?
Well, there's a whole word for it. It's called apostasy.
Yes. Okay.
Right. So we know that people change, for example, their religious beliefs. People change their beliefs all the time. I mean, so my introductory classes, I would say to students, okay, so these are 18 to 21 or 22-year-olds. Occasionally there's some older people, but do you believe everything that you believe now? Did you believe that 5 years ago? Did you have any change of mind? Go back 5 years ago, go back before that, and think of things that you believe that you no longer believe. And it's amazing how many people will say, yeah, I really believe a lot of things that are different. Then I'll say, okay, so extrapolate out from that 5 years from now. Do you think you'll change your mind? Most people, the overwhelming majority of people, will say yes. And if you don't, then you can ask them to put, this is in the book too, scales. Scales is one of the most important things that I've come up with. I love it. I use it all the time. So you can ask them to rate what percentage of their beliefs are true, what percentage, and then you could break it down by domain. But we know people change their beliefs all the time. I've probably changed my beliefs in the last year about pretty significant things.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, so good. I'm glad I framed that. Obviously, people change beliefs,
Yeah.
but I want to
Go ahead, go for it.
zoom in on that a little bit. And I've watched this. As we know, I've taught a few classes for. I've been in this. You've had me speaking.
Yeah, thank you for doing that.
No worries,
great.
but and the whole, and we've talked in those classes about changing beliefs because because people inevitably talk about atheism, even or science, changing your beliefs about the universe.
Correct.
But it wasn't, obviously people change their minds. Some people never do. Some people change their beliefs. But I guess the question I really want to say is how the whole point of the book is that by having impossible conversations.
Yeah.
It's that people change their beliefs primarily because of conversations. And that's what I was going to ask you. Have you asked your students how many people change their beliefs because of conversations or because of internal conversations? I mean, external conversations with others versus, seems to me that potentially it's the internal conversations that change much more belief than the external ones. But I wanted your evidence of that. I wanted to hear.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how they're so connected. I don't know how one would do that, because the external conversations facilitate the internal conversations, because then people start thinking about it and talking about it engaging it themselves, and then they go back to the people usually. So there's a covariance and a reciprocity there.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could be sparked by hearing something in a conversation, then go back and think about it. That's the best part of. I mean, that's what learning is too. I mean,
exactly.
I always say in lectures, it's the lecture itself isn't important. It's going back later and thinking about it that really is the part of learning, and that takes place in universities. But
go ahead.
But it's I guess you have a lot. I noticed the book has a ton of footnotes and references at the third of the book.
A ton. I know, a ton, and I didn't read those in the audiobook.
I know, and no, I know, and and I'm always skeptical of authority, or appealing to authority. But the question I was going to have is, you give all these rules, which make eminent sense, and I'm sure you quote studies, but personally, what personal evidence do you have that these rules work? Is what I mean. It's an antagonistic question.
No, that's you can ask me any question you want. That's a great question. So when I published my first book, I think in 2013, that I wanted to call Street Epistemology.
Yes.
Now there are literally tens of thousands of people who, and they've refined it. Many of these people are much better at this than I am. And you can see these videos online. Excuse me, Reed Nicewonder, Anthony Magnabosco, Pine Creek. They do street epistemology, and you can see people change their mind in real time, or people will come back to those people and say, hey, we had this conversation. You really made me think. I've changed my mind. So that was the impetus. And I want to offer something to your listeners. There's a simple technique that I talk about in the book. This is not part of the Socratic method. And again, to use what I said before, I look at the Socratic method as a skeleton that ought to be fleshed out by the latest data and evidence from various Hoshes negotiations, applied epistemology, etc., cult exiting. So one question that we talk about, so there's a template. If you follow the template, you can see anybody who follows the template will see the results immediately. You build rapport.
I'm always wary about that. It sounds like a diet, a commercial.
No, well, you after you do it, 10, 15 times, then you can play with it or what have you. Okay. But when you first start, just strictly adhere to the template. You build rapport, you listen, you repeat back to someone.
Let me read them. Let me read the early template. I mean, because I was going to go through. There's seven. There's seven. The 7 fundamentals of good conversations. You call it the being. One is to know the goals of the conversation. I wanted to spend maybe 2 minutes in each, or 1 minute each.
Wow, this is a thorough podcast. Well, okay.
Yeah, well, it is indeed. It's not. This is not just fluff, Okay. Anyway, goals, partnership, view conversations as partnerships, which I think is very important. Build a rapport, listen. Then you say shoot the messenger, which we'll talk about. know your intentions, and walk away. So let's go through each of them in 30
I was
seconds.
looking for
or
the
so.
book, but I don't have it. But
Doesn't
okay,
matter.
yeah.
Presumably
I
you
wrote
can
it, so
remember
it
some of
doesn't matter.
Well, I don't remember a lot of what I've written, so it's okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so goals. You know your purpose. So
Yeah. So basically, it's very helpful to people if they know why they're in a conversation. What do they want to get out of it? And if that changes, that's fine. But you should have some kind of intentionality. If it's just, for me right now with you, it's just to have a good conversation and we're just shooting the ball. I don't need to do anything. I'm not interested really raising my public profile or whatever. I'm interested in this conversation for people who listen to this to get more out of it than they would of Googling or Wikipedia, etc. So that's my goal in this conversation. So I've clarified that to begin with, but and you can change your goal at any time. Maybe I don't think this conversation will be antagonistic, but if it is, I'll try to de-escalate it, and then so people can model that if they want to do it. So it's always a good idea to have a goal in mind, even if that goal changes.
Okay, it wasn't just to see me.
No. Though
Okay.
It's nice to talk to you again.
Okay, yeah. Okay, no. Then the second is partnership, which is really an important one. View conversations not as the person you're having a conversation with not as an adversary, but as an adversary, I should say, but as a partner. You want to go into that?
That's part of the problem is that people look at those with whom they're having a conversation as adversaries in terms of instead of partners. That's a lot of the mistakes that we have now. And most people are just they're trying to figure stuff out, or they're completely convinced that they know something. And then even in any case, in all but the most absolutely extreme cases, and maybe even in those cases, viewing a conversation, the person with whom you're speaking as a partner rather than an adversary will produce better outcomes.
Absolutely. And there was, and I made a note to myself that one of the ways you can think of your conversation partner as a partner and not as an adversary is to think about what you can learn from them, which is actually very helpful for me when I think about when I have these conversations, and what you can learn and how you can change your own views because of that. And that's why I wrote the note Hitchens, because that's where I was going to point out that that's where conversations can be most important, because you can change your own views. And by not having the conversation, by saying this person's an idiot, I refuse to talk to them, you lose the opportunity to learn. So thinking that you can learn from everyone is important. And you know what? Sometimes I have to say, in my own experience, and I'm even older than you, if such a thing is possible, a lot older actually, but it took me a long time to realize, maybe because I've been involved in academia so long and it's such a pompous thing, to realize that there's not a single conversation I had with anybody that I haven't been able to learn from. You can learn from anybody. And, instead of having this effete attitude that someone has to be of a certain, whatever, intellectual character or whatever. And it takes a long time to realize that.
Yeah. The other thing that you can learn is that you learn that there are patterns of thought that emerge in people. So you learn that there are patterns of fallacious reasoning that emerge, but you also realize that people who speak English, who live in the same culture, you can extract commonalities from those, and then as you have future conversations, you can use what you learn. I was in a cab or Uber once, and I had a really interesting conversation with someone, my driver, about Nipsey Hussle. Long story, but that I knew that I would use that later on, so I filed that, and that's probably come up in 4 conversations now. And I almost every time people are totally blown away when I talk to them about Nipsey Hussle. But that's just a fact. That's different from a process of reasoning that people use, and that to me is what's interesting. All right, let's whip through the rest of them.
Okay. Rapport, which is and that's
vital.
Building rapport. And one of the aspects that I'm gonna, I gotta try to be honest, whatever, that really impacted me when I thought of things I do wrong, and I recognize I do wrong, is don't have a parallel conversation.
I can't even. Okay,
I do that so much.
This.
I do that so much.
An hour on this.
Someone, and your example is so perfect. Someone says they've been to Cuba and talked to you, and then your response is, "Oh, I've been to Cuba. Here's what I did." And I'm guilty of that far too much, I know. But instead of saying that, saying, "Oh, what was your experience of Cuba like? What did you learn?" And again, my wife is so much better at that, because she can ask questions, and she, instead of interjecting her own experience and it's something that's very important, and it makes the conversation so much more productive.
Yeah, parallel talk is one thing. Rapport, the bigger the gulf, the more rapport you need. And we talk about exactly how to do it. That's why also, just parenthetically, the push that we have now to break people into ever finer categories, oh, this person's black or Jewish or whatever,
Yeah.
in a wheelchair. We should be doing exactly the opposite. We should be looking for supraordinate identities where we go up. What commonalities do we have? Something else that you can do is never ask someone what they do for work. Ask them what they do for fun, right? So find things that you like. Maybe they like your father, their father, grandfather, whatever you are, friend, boyfriend.
Yeah.
You live in this city. You like science fiction. You like jujitsu. Whatever it is that they whatever commonalities. But the rapport building is absolutely indispensable. Anthony Magnabosco is incredibly good at that.
And yes, okay. And now the next thing, indicating that hopefully I've been listening, is to listen, and to listen, not talk. Which is, I have to say, a lot of people always criticize that they think I'm talking too much in these things. I try to have a conversation, but to listen to what the person's saying, and that means really listen, not just listen and be prepared to say something in response, but to listen to what they're actually saying.
Yeah, and there are techniques and tools that you can use. Minimal encourages. That's from hostage negotiation, where you repeat the last few words. Rapport's first and second rule, where you say, put the burden of understanding on yourself. Am I understanding this? And then repeat back what you think you heard. And I think we give like 20 or so rules in there.
Okay, but that's an important one. We'll go over the last three quickly. Shoot the messenger.
Don't deliver messages. That's what most conversations turn into, and we talk about how to avoid that later. You have a message, they have a message, everyone has a message.
Yeah, and yeah,
those aren't conversations.
And just let me say, I'm letting you deliver your message here. So
okay, all right.
So feel free.
All right.
Intentions, which is different than goals, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, people just assume that other people have bad intentions if they have different, especially now in this insane zeitgeist. But they so just assume that your conversation partner has better intentions than you think that they have.
And then finally, I guess if you find they don't, walk away.
Yeah, you got to know when to walk away, and you have to kind of have a gauge of when it's no longer safe to be in a conversation. That almost never happens to me, but it has happened on occasion, and I've walked away. And we talk about how to do that.
There's a good song about that, knowing when to hold them and when to fold them and when to walk away.
Oh yeah.
You thought you'd catch it early, but yes, okay, yeah. Kenny Rogers. But knowing eventually when it's not gonna be productive. And I think part of that, but let me push back a little bit, because
sure.
That's really important. But part of the problem is that many of us take number 7 and put it at number 1 or 2. Namely, it's quite easy to assess someone really early on and saying it's not worth having this conversation.
Yeah, so that's not what that section is about. That section is about if someone's become violent or there's a danger or the threat to you. Because some people will be just set off to insanity.
Well, let me be Socrates here and say, well, that's nice, but what about people who think that hearing something that they disagree with is violence?
Yeah, we talk about that in chapter 6. You're skipping ahead.
That's not an answer, but give me your answer.
Okay, well, I can give you the answer. If someone thinks, I'll give you Socrates' response to that when they said he's not allowed to ask questions anymore. He said, why?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Just a Socrates joke. I don't know how many of them there are.
No, but I'm serious.
But I'm serious
if you think someone's going to be threatening you, that's a personal perception. And I'm worried that, it's hard to think about it objectively, because we all have different senses of what's threatening. And nowadays, the big problem is people are threatened by everything. And so...
Yeah, and they feel threatened by your immutable characteristics. If you're white, cis, hetero male, and my age, then you're in the worst possible category. So they won't even... Usually those people, you actually have to worry about them even less, because they won't even talk to you or look at you at all. They won't say anything to you.
So I would argue that in some sense, that 7, walk away, should be held really, really far down. I mean, it should be suppressed as much as possible, because it's a natural tendency, I think, of most of us to feel this person is either unworthy or antagonistic, and maybe
Okay.
we should, and that comes to intentions again.
Okay, so that's when we so I have to jump ahead a little bit. So
Sure.
that's when we talk about scales. How confident are you the belief is true on a scale from say 1 to 10, with 10 being absolute unshakable confidence, 1 being no possible way it's true, 5 being maybe, 7 being it's probably true. You know, many people will not have conversations with people who say 10. So that they can walk away if they say 10. But once if you follow the template, then you can figure out if you want to remain in the conversation anymore. I know friends of mine love it when people say 10. Other people are like, I'm not going to waste my time with this.
Let me ask you finally. Okay, so I kept asking myself, because we've had discussions, and I've watched you and discuss with other people, and as I say, I know myself. I fall, even though I try and think of these things, I fall in many of these traps all the time when I have conversations.
I do too.
Well, I was going to ask you how, you've written a book on this. How well do you follow it in your? I mean, how much when you have conversations, you find that you can internalize it and you can step back, or that your emotions overcome you? Or
I make mistakes all the time. I just had a very heated conversation with someone 2 days ago. Someone who stopped talking to me. So I'm not going to go into the details for that. Although they're kind of interesting. And I started the conversation just by listening to her. And so she was, I don't want to talk about what it is, because there are legal considerations. But I started off the conversation. It's the other plight of being a 56-year-old white heterosexual man. I have like 50 lawyers. I have lawyers for everything. When you poke the hornet's nest in particular, but and I started off, I really listened to her, and I genuinely listened to her. I repeated back to make sure I understood it. I built rapport even before I did that, and she was clearly not only upset, just I don't even know what the word would be. She was just
livid.
No, it's kind of like a shaking internally, but anyway, but I managed to smooth it out. I did catch myself making several mistakes, like buts, or it's always good to end these things on a question, at each interaction, to end on a question. But so to answer your question, so that went well, but there's been other times where I have to kind of impose something on myself to just, so it's different if you're trying to figure out what someone believes and they have an odious belief. There's a difference between that and if it's something personal about you, in which the subject has an emotional valence. So you have to kind of have an additional level of self-reflection and bringing it down again. But so I think I'm pretty good, but I definitely notice myself making a lot of mistakes, and then I do the best that I can to try and correct those.
Well, that's good if we can, and I think that's the key thing, is to try and think. That's why this book's useful. Is it's all of us after the fact, we can ask ourselves what we could have done better, or whatever. But the reason I asked partly is because I know you personally, and you're kind of an energetic, in your face kind of person, which of course, being in your face is sort of almost the antithesis of what you're talking about. And so by nature, you tend to be in the face kind of person. I'm wondering how often you have to sort of step back and
and I get a lot of I'll switch languages on here. I get a lot of scheisse from the people in the street epistemology. That's where you have to split it out.
It's see, I'm interrupting, but
no, go ahead.
But no, I know you don't mind. People are going to complain. I'll tell you, I guarantee you. But the street epistemology. But that's again, it was the next place I was going to go to, because you wanted to call that book Street Epistemology. The first term I heard that term was from you, and I think you may have created it. But you've been involved in it more lately since leaving.
Yeah, that's right. I stepped back from it because of the grievance studies stuff.
Yeah, we're going to get to grievance studies, but I want to hit street epistemology, because it seemed to me one video that you did this video about reversing the teaching, and you asking questions and them giving answers.
The whole series about that.
Of course, but I mean, my experience of teaching is asking questions, but you did a whole neat series. But it seemed to me it began in a way which the one that you did at Portland State, I guess, where you had that sign up. I forget what it said.
There are two genders.
There are two genders. if you wanted to start a
Or
conversation,
there are only two genders.
yeah, there are only two genders.
Right.
And your point was to get a conversation about that. But by putting that up, you raised people's hackles immediately and had to spend a huge amount of time stepping back. Was that in retrospect? I mean, I was intrigued by that because the few people you did manage to engage in conversations with, well, then you start asking the question and say, look, I'm not saying there are two genders. This is an assertion. Let's talk about it. But if you wanted to build a rapport and view it as a partnership, it seemed to me that was potentially an unusual way to begin such a, you saw the people on the roof yelling at you because they're conditioned to think that you are some right-wing nut who's going around saying there are only two genders and we should blah, blah. And so it seemed to me that you were automatically putting them in a position of disliking you.
Okay, so there's a lot there.
Yeah.
So briefly, the in your face thing. So
Yeah.
I am more in your face, and I get grief from people who are regular practitioners of street epistemology all the time for that. And you can watch people who have criticisms of those. Anybody can watch these videos.
Can you at least explain that? Since I referred to that video and I've seen it and other people may not have, can you say the context of what I'm talking about and maybe?
Yeah. Okay. So we do, my team and I have a nonprofit called National Progress Alliance, and our goals are to basically move the needle on the cultural madness right now, mostly on the left, although not exclusively on the left, to help people think about free speech and open inquiry as nonpartisan values. And a lot of what we do centers on the universities and the educational system, which we can get to later. So I did a 9 or 10 university tour around the country, and I was canceled at Berkeley, although we managed to do that because the president who sponsored us kept threatening the administration with lawsuits. He was amazing. Those videos are up. I was canceled at Yale. I was canceled at Brown. I was canceled someplace else. But so we would go and we would do a kind of street epistemology. It's called, well, it doesn't really have a name, but you put people, you make a Likert scale. Strongly disagree, slightly disagree, neutral. I'm hearing an echo in my headset. And up to strongly agree. And then you put people on the neutral line, you read the claim, and then they step to a line. And then you engage in a form of Socratic questioning with them to see if they change, if anybody changes anybody else's mind, if they change their own mind, and we encourage them to move along the line. So basically we will release videos of that. I do this other thing that you don't see in that video, and that, okay, before I go on, was that clear?
Yeah. No, I think sort of clear. But the echo thing was, when bottom line is there are actually physical lines you draw, and people line up, and the whole point is that there's a statement, and people, say whether they agree with it or disagree with it, and then there's a conversation.
Correct.
The problem is sometimes if the statement is there are only two genders, and that's all.
Okay, hold on. We got to build to there. Hold on.
Okay.
So what you don't see, but we'll release videos about that, is that we ask people in the audience beforehand to come up on the board and write any claim they want down. And we tell them that we want them, which is the purpose of the whole tour, to be able to talk about things now, to calibrate their beliefs to the evidence that they have in a way that they're not comfortable talking about it in their university classroom. So what they should be getting out of an education, they're not. I'm attempting to give them some of that. And so I use this thing. Oh, you're a scientist. You probably know. It's called the Delphi technique. It's a predictive model. I published a piece about this. It's a predictive method for asking. It was originally used in among people to make predictions of certain technologies. Where do you think we'll be in 20 years, this technology? And then it goes through multiple iterations. But I do the same thing. I have a modified Delphi technique that I use with questions people produce. And so the audience votes on what questions that we're going to ask. So I don't pick those questions. And rare occasions, I throw some questions on the board just so that to get the ball rolling, if you will. But I usually don't even do that. So the question that you saw, there are only two genders. We didn't come up with that. In fact, there are like 6 or 7 questions. One is about, is the Earth overpopulated? I didn't come up with that. I don't come up with any of these. I shouldn't say any. Maybe once in a blue moon, there's a question that I put on the board beforehand that people happen to vote on in that iterative process. But I don't come up with those questions. People come up with those questions.
The people involved at that time, or people at an earlier time?
And anybody can come up. And anybody, we
So-
will write literally any question on the board anybody
So-
wants.
Oh, so that question that they saw was a result of a iterative process that had already occurred.
If that at Portland State, no, that was not. Most of them. So if they're in buildings, then we
Yeah.
do the iterative process. If they're outside of buildings, then we usually ask people what claims they want to talk about, and then they'll throw out a claim, and then I'll refine the claim, and sometimes if they throw out a question, I'll make it into a claim. But I don't choose those claims.
So the bottom line is that their only two genders came from talking to people at that time and then making a big sign.
And there are 6 or 7 others that we did that day, and those are all different claims. None of which I didn't come up with any of those.
Okay, but the interesting thing is that of course people from a distance only see the claim and don't know what you're doing, and then
So what should you do in that question?
No. Look,
you should say, well, what are you doing if you're interested at all?
Yeah, exactly. But I guess the point is that if people feel they're being attacked, they become defensive. And so, it was interesting to watch those people. My natural inclination was to assume these people were closed-minded, whatever. And then some of them I realized, well, they'd been, somewhere else, and they were seeing someone who they thought was coming and evangelizing on campus, like used to see on campus too. And you dismiss them or just say, get off campus because you're annoying people. I'm
not sure that I don't think that's a remarkable hermeneutic of charity. I don't think that's what was happening. In fact, I'm quite confident it was not what was happening.
Okay, good. Well, I was trying to assume the best, but okay. Anyway, we've got about a conversation. Sorry, go on.
No, it's good to assume the best about people.
Yeah, it's hard to do sometimes. But anyway, speaking of the best, so I've gotten that part of that part of this conversation where I wanted to talk about ways of getting people to think about the things, but then going from inmates to religion to the conversations, and now I'm going to move. Then you turn to it sort of attacking another shibboleth. Okay, religion was one, and you'd make these statements that it's an unreliable epistemology, which I agree with completely. The other shibboleth, which you then turn to, and I cannot talk to you without having a discussion, is grievance studies and gender studies and your experience and the fame and your hoaxes, because those had a big impact on you and on your career as well, and your experience at Portland State, among other things. So in 2017,
I've kind of talked about this to death, but okay.
Yeah, we're not. It's only going to be. The good thing about this is that we've been going for an hour and 20 minutes. This is a small part of the conversation, but I think it's an important part.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I figure that's what most people talk to you about almost uniquely, but I think it's an important discussion to have because the context of what's happening in a broader sense now. I mean, one used to be able to make fun of certain disciplines because everyone realized they were just not scholarship, and I think and grievance studies and to some extent gender studies are examples of these kind of disciplines, and that of course that will provoke a lot of people. The fact they said it, but you and collaborators and colleagues, some of whom I know, decided to do this using a technique which I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, and you will, I know, maybe it was inspired by Alan Sokal, who did a famous
directly.
Yeah, Alan Sokal did a famous hoax, which I wrote about and talked about, arguing that that nonsense, if you phrased it in the terms of, if you took terms from advanced physics, you could make a philosophical paper that was full of nonsense and it would be accepted. And he gave it, and it was a great example, and it caused a lot of discussion. Now, you started this with a paper, which I think you wrote with James Lindsay. I don't know, but I think it was The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct.
Correct.
In 2017, which, anyone who parses those words realizes this is nonsense. But of course, you did get it published, but it was in a low impact journal.
Correct.
Okay. And there was criticism of that eventually because people said, hey, well, you just have to pay the money. There's some journals, and it's true. There's some journals where if you pay the money, you'll get published. It doesn't. That's just the way it is. But then you followed up with 20 hoax
Okay,
papers.
hold on. So
Good. I'm glad.
the key at this juncture is critics said to us, this simply does not do what you claim to do. This does not show that there's a problem in the literature. This is not. If you really wanted to show that, you need to do A, B, C, D, E, higher ranked journals, more papers, et cetera, et cetera. So they gave us a roadmap. And so I said, dude, let's do this. I mean, they've just literally given us the best gift we could possibly have. And he said, okay. So we did it.
Yeah. So that's the point.
Exactly what they wanted us to do. Literally, exactly.
And there were 20 papers, and eventually it got exposed because one paper called Gender, Place, and Culture.
Gender, Place, and Culture.
What was it called? Sorry?
It was in that was the journal. And you should Google.
Okay, and
Google the impact factor of that.
Yeah,
too.
and what was the paper? What was that title?
Oh, it's about the queer performativity and of dog parks in Portland.
Oh, that was the famous dog park queer. Okay.
Yeah.
And anyway, eventually it caused people to criticize enough that people started to investigate it. And the Wall Street Journal did an investigation, right? And
so I think we had 7 published or accepted to be published.
Seven were published.
We had 13 will probably would have been published. I think 12. I mean, I can't remember. That's been some social scientists made that prediction, but we got better at writing these toward the end, and we really figured out the logic of this, and we immersed ourselves in this absolutely fully. Like this was literally all I would do is read the grievance studies literature morning, noon, and night.
And you learn the absolute the popcorn jargon that just word salad that's just these words that don't relate and they go in the same sentence.
Okay, so it's less the word salad and more that you need to forward certain ideas and just hammer them home. And once you realize what ideas should be forwarded, then you're looking at the top journals in the field. You're looking at Hypatia. You're looking at you mentioned Gender, Place, Culture, but it's fascinating to me. Maybe this jumps ahead a little bit, but would anybody say, oh wow, like we asked you to do this and you did it, and maybe there's a problem here? No. What I see, someone just pointed out to me the other day on Wikipedia, it's like low impact journals. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? These nobody would say this is the lead feminist journal in the world in player. Okay, you want to call that a low impact journal? Great. Take it out of everybody's promotion and tenure basket. Great. I'd love to see Hypatia deserve the ridicule it gets. No, I mean, so even after you did this, so that's like the disconfirmation criteria, the defeasibility criteria. We did exactly what they wanted us to do, and then they're changing. They're not even moving the goalpost. They're just saying, and then they're making a tax on me, and they brought me up on charges, but I'm getting,
I know you're getting defensive about it, but my point was to say the first one, the conceptual penis was in a low impact journal, but then you proceeded to publish these papers in significant journals and get rave reviews before they were. I mean, I loved one of these things. Someone said it was enlightening about the intersection between masculinity and anality. How could you write that? So like a Woody Allen line. I mean, it's that is important for feminist scholars. And so, the
significant contribution to the literature was one quotation.
Yeah. And so the question is, but some people have said, so I want to ask about your retrospective view of this. Obviously you've been attacked a lot, and it's natural to jump to a defense. Some people have said that
hold on a second. I just want to say, it's not that I guess I'm a little defensive. It's just that it's just not true. Like things that they're saying, they're just false.
I know, and it's very frustrating.
Like, it's not like they're attacking me for something I've done and then I'm no, it's that they're attacking me for something I didn't even do.
Oh yeah, I know. I've been there, done that. So yeah, I mean, that's the worst part is when you didn't, you just, what are they're creating a straw man that they like, and then they're, but having said that, what are your thoughts after the fact? Some people have said that even the ones who Well, there are a lot of people who were amused by this and supportive of it, because I do think it shows the lack of scholarship and silliness of a number of these assessments. But what they also said was that it actually may show the system works, that eventually peer review will lead to discussion, which will eventually reveal things as nonsense.
That's completely ridiculous.
Okay.
No, that's
I read that. I
utterly,
read someone say that.
profoundly false.
Great. Well, I'm throwing that out as a way to get you to respond to it.
Well, if that were the case, it wouldn't have been the Wall Street journalists and others who picked up on the piece. It would have been the reviewers. It would have been internally. The other thing is that there's a built-in prophylactic to prevent any form of discussion or any form of exposing this charlatanism, and that's the Institutional Review Board. You could never have. So we should probably back up and say, and there are punitive mechanisms in place to prevent people who want to do this. Now that I'm not in the academy, I could, if I wanted to do this again, I will leave it at that. But they brought me up on 3 charges, and it was a total kangaroo court, falsifying data. One was plagiarism. I pled guilty, by the way, to their charge of plagiarism. I plagiarized Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, and I said I'm guilty. And I said in that meeting repeatedly, I have plagiarized Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. I am guilty, and they found me innocent of charges that they themselves brought up against me, plagiarism, and I pled guilty to it. And they would there's a mechanism in place because remember, these are moral actors. These are not scientists trying to build a better mousetrap, whatever. These are people who are on a moral crusade. And
when you say these are people, who are you referring to? The investigators or the journal or the journal?
The investigators absolutely were on a moral crusade. There's no question about it.
These university investigators are just they're calling them investigators is an insult to the word investigator.
Their offices in search of tasks, and they need tasks they're staffed with people who are true believers. But
the true believers, they believe exactly. They don't want to hear anything else. They know what the answer is in advance. They don't even. It's not unnecessary to have the questions.
Correct. And I can say that to you because you've experienced it. I've experienced it. But from people outside looking in, they must think we're paranoid. But it's not. It's happened to so many people right now. But even bracketing that aside, so. Okay, so what was your question? Like, what is my retrospective?
I was gonna. What's your retrospective on it? And then I was gonna go to your experience at Portland State, but let's talk about your retrospective, and maybe you'll include Portland State as part of it. But what would you do differently? Would you do anything differently, or you think it was a success?
I made a fatal mistake. I made an absolutely fatal mistake. One of the fake researchers, we needed to give her a degree, and so I gave her a doctorate in feminist studies. I should have given her a doctorate in gender studies. There are not many people who have doctorates in feminist studies, and so one of the journalists called around and found out that the person doesn't exist, and that was really the undoing of the whole project. And that was a huge mistake on my part, and I lament that. But anyway, we would have gotten more papers published, and we would have had time to put out videos explaining what the problem in the system is and why it's leaking from the academy to the society. Because at the time, now everybody knows that's the case, but at the time, that was the one major piece that was missing, that these corrupt bodies of scholarship are affecting public policy, and they're just. Yeah. Okay. So let me pause there and see if you have any questions.
Well, I love where you're going, because each time you do it, you're hitting on something I want to touch in the right order. So exactly, it is. So, gender studies, it's affecting public policy, but that's moved to another area of so-called scholarship, which is really affecting public policy a lot more, and that's critical race theory.
Correct.
Which may sort of gender studies squared. Is that unfair to say?
I've never thought about it like that. That's an interesting way to say it. Yeah, I mean, so many people have done such wonderful work on critical race theory, and these things are byproducts of the academy. They've not only spilled out, they're now not only ascendant but dominant in.
Oh, they're dominant. They're dominant not just society, but in the academy, in science organizations. They're one of these things where the assumptions are not questioned. It's
correct.
Assumed to be correct, and then we work from there. It's just like assuming God exists.
Right. Right. So there's not even a possibility of it being false or wrong. and there are no conditions under which it could be falsified. It's not
No
falsifiable.
condition,
So if it's not falsifiable, it's not science. So if it's not science, what is it? It's ideology. It's just being taught. It's a moral value that there's an insanity right now. There are multiple insanities in the culture, some of which are competing with each other, others are not. Critical race theory, any department with studies in it is almost universally corrupted.
Now, it's in. Go on.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. You go.
Well,
that's from the book, by the way, when two people speak at the same time.
Yeah, you give it back. I know. I was thinking about it. I remember that from the book. Yeah. Always say, no, you go. No, you go. You go. It's like in Portland, with that famous Portlandia thing where people are just four-way stop and no one ever wants to go.
Right.
But the difference, though, it's not falsifiable, but it's even worse. I mean, string theory may not be falsifiable, but it's not critical race theory.
I was thinking about Brian Greene's criticism of that. Yeah.
No, but the difference is, well, there's two things. One, the difference is string theorists are actually looking. The string theorists are looking for a way to find it falsifiable, so their goals are honest. But there's another big difference, although maybe it's not such a difference because people used to get kicked out of the academy for this too. But the big difference in critical race theory, what always amazes me, it's exactly like the old witch trials, is if you do question it, then it's proof that it's true. That it's proof that you're racist. If you do question the assumption,
you have a kind of fragility.
It's like being a witch, right. If you were thrown in the water and you drowned, well, you weren't a witch. If you floated, you were a witch, and you'd be killed. So there's no winning.
That's the Kafka trap. That's correct.
Yeah. And that, to me, strikes me as perhaps the most insidious part of it is not just that it's dogma, that it's a secular religion, which it certainly is, but that.
By the way, I think I was the first person with Lindsay to come up with that idea, and McWhorter and others ran with it, and good for them. And we published a piece in All Think, Privilege is the Original Sin. Okay, and we talked about this as a religion. I think I was the first person. Andrew Doyle.
Probably. I know. And I think it's a common thing. Great minds think alike. I remember before, because I didn't read a lot of literature, the first thing that occurred to me was secular religion. I was in a debate in Oxford on is everyone religious, and I came on the side saying yes, partly because if everyone wasn't religious, then we wouldn't need science. Everyone would automatically be a scientist.
Yep.
But also that people, just because people weren't religious in the true sense, they could be secular religious, and that's
correct.
That's become in some sense even more insidious because
it is because now they've captured secular organizations and institutions like the academy, and they have institutionalized these ideas. That's the problem. These are not fringe ideas. They're not fringe theories. It's not only, you said, D'Angelo's claim and about white fragility, although I don't think you used the term white fragility. It's that's been institutionalized. So any kind of questioning of the orthodoxy means that you are part of the problem, and therefore we need to, you need to go to training, or you need to remediate that somehow, or sign these papers, or you need
or go or leave. Leave
for the long march to the institutions. Leave.
Now, what do you have to say about this? A good friend of mine who we talked to said, and it should be obvious, but isn't it unusual that all these university leaders, heads of the National Academy of Sciences, of the editors of scientific journals, all say, take heads of universities, our university has been racist and we have to overcome it. But if they really believe that, shouldn't they resign?
Yeah, that's what I've always said, and I put out a long time. One, be the quit in equity.
Yeah.
If you genuinely believe that, and I've put this out on Twitter, it's a repeat. If you're a white, then you should resign. If you genuinely. The other thing is much less simple. It's even simpler than that. If you actually believe that, do away with legacy admissions. Yeah. But they don't. It's the simplest thing in the world. Just do away with legacy admissions.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I'd be in favor of course.
Well, I would be in favor of that too. But you, especially, you talk about equity and the generations of accumulated wealth and social capital and educational capital, et cetera. Well, then but they don't do that. So it tells me that they don't believe that. That's just verbal behavior.
It's virtue signaling, which is the worst.
Virtue signaling is verbal behavior. They don't actually believe it. So they themselves are part of the problem, which leads to my prediction. We are going to come, and I don't know it's obvious that this has an expiration date. I don't know when it is. We haven't talked about this at all, but we see, I guess you can make parallels to Tuskegee. We see the mutilation of genitals of children under the guise of gender reaffirming, gender affirmation, etc. This is so utterly grotesque and monstrous. No sane person is going to be able to defend this practice and what happened in a few years from now. And we are going to look back in this, and I'm going to predict to you, you think you're smart, don't think you're smart, make predictions. We are going to see epic gaslighting. We are going to see unprecedented gaslighting. People say, I never believed that. I never went along. I had nothing to do with it. That wasn't me. Because that's the only way that this can be. It's not even a rationalization of the thing. It has to be an abject, outright denial of the horrors. And we see something to a lesser extent now with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, as I've argued for years, people have been hoodwinked by these words. Like, I can understand how a normal person on the street.
It sounds good.
Yeah, it sounds great. It sounds
great. I used to
it,
be, when I was department chair, and I would be trying 30 years ago, 20 years ago, trying to, encourage those good words. And they are good words. They are, well, maybe equality better than equity.
I was going to say equity. Yeah, I bet you didn't use equity. But so get back to what we were talking about. So the same thing with the history, the trajectory, I don't know if it's an emerging theme, but one thing we've talked about is all of this stuff falls squarely within the domain of skepticism. And how do we figure things out? How do we know it's true? In around 2012, I recognized it was a problem. I started asking people for evidence for, what is the evidence of microaggressions, trigger warnings, safe space? No one had any evidence. People would get increasingly upset, and I would really be conscious about how I asked the question. So in that sense, I wasn't in interface at all. I was just asking, and sometimes in writing, literally nothing. And it wasn't, nobody thought it was a problem that we're institutionalizing these policies for which we have no evidence. And again, if someone's becoming upset with you for asking a question about a policy, what's the evidence of the policy, as opposed to just providing the evidence, you are not the problem.
Yeah. No, that's right. And that's,
if they had a problem, they just present. If they had evidence, that they just present evidence. But they don't have any evidence.
Yeah, and so exactly. And it's just, and that's what frustrates me the most as a scientist. I don't, I'm used to the other disciplines and maybe putting them down. But when I see science journals like Science Magazine making these statements that medicine is sexist or racist, I said, what's the evidence? Show me some evidence. Universities are, for better or worse, have been, the most enlightened area in terms of, racism and sexism, far more enlightened than the rest of the society early on. But they're they were the safest places to be instead of the opposite.
No, absolutely. And many people have repeatedly state that in what happened to Nicholas Christakis at Yale, etc.
Yeah, sure.
And I think what's really important to understand in this conversation is that you and I are operating more or less within the same paradigm: reason, evidence. I don't want to say scientific skepticism, because that might be too narrow of a band.
Skepticism, but the scientific method is. I mean,
scientific method, skepticism,
that encompasses it all.
Right. Okay. So for the people not operating under that paradigm, those, I don't even want to say world, because I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Those ways of viewing reality are themselves subjective, and there are bodies and lines of literature on this. They seek to preserve the power. It's called privilege preserving epistemic pushback. They seek to preserve the power of those who advocate positions in alignment with them. So anyone who would use, for example, evidence, reason, epistemological rigor, all of those features are examples of people who participate in a reality in which their sole goal, whether they know it or not, is to preserve their position in the social hierarchy, to preserve their position as white colonialist oppressors. So that's the way that these people are thinking about the problem. Aubrey Lord's famous, the master's tools cannot disable the master's house, disassemble the master's house. The idea is that you can't use the very tools that created oppressive systems in hierarchies to disable those hierarchies. You need new tools.
Yeah.
And in their case, you also need new epistemologies like standpoint epistemology. You need new ways of overcoming oppression, not the old ways of evidence, reason, science.
Yeah, these tools which work have become the enemy, absolutely. And unfortunately, I mean, as I say, as an effete scientist, I watch this with amusement and scorn at Yale
nothing
30 years
amusing
ago.
about it.
No,
Yeah.
no, exactly, because we could say, oh, well, that was just the English department, that. But now it's those same perceptions are being used in science. In fact, I just told you this morning. I mean, I'm writing a piece. It's so ridiculous that in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, it was just a big meeting where some historian of science said you're all racist and it's a racist thing, and so they've gotten rid of the word intelligence. You can't search for intelligence because apparently that is a white construct, as it was described in the meeting. And what that means is it shuts down the tools. You can't use the tools at all. You can't listen or look. So,
but that's but this is what's crucial to understand. That's the goal. The goal is to remove the tools of analysis because the tools themselves produce racist outcomes, which perpetuate systems of inequality.
Absolutely. Okay, great. So I want to. It's so disgusting. I want to move away from this area in a second.
Yeah.
But I want to say, because people ask me this too, and it's an impossible answer, but I'll ask you. So what do we do?
Oh, I think that's actually a far easier question than people think that it is.
Okay.
I could spend an hour on this. Let's see if I can just give you I'll just.
I've thought a lot about it too. So okay.
Yeah, the first thing you have to do is to just. This is a very unsexy answer, but you just have to show up. Like if they have meetings, etc. Like when you look at meetings of people who go to these, especially public meetings, they're only like 10, 15 people, and they're the most radical fringe leftists, the most woke people imaginable. There's almost never any centrist or someone who says, "Hey, let's take another look at this." So show up. The second thing is, parrhesia, speak truth in the face of danger. And you'll lose I'm giving you the short version of this. You lose your friendships, etc., but your life will be much better off. Third thing is you have to document literally freaking everything. Document. Videos are the gold standard. Make recordings. Look at whatever the state law is. If there's a 1-party or 2-party recording state, if I have to tell people to record, so don't break the law, and then make those public, like Paul Rossi and others have done, because that's just. That's just the problem is that there's so much craziness. And let me just finish. And the most important thing by far is that we have to build new institutions. Like at this point, everyone, I hear all this, how do we save this or this atrocity? My very dear friend, Joshua Katz, what they did to him at Princeton, absolute disgrace. I mean, utterly unmitigated disgrace.
Just one example of many, many disgraces.
I mean, in his example, it was egregious. Like he spoke against the orthodoxy, and then they came for him with a vengeance. But we have to build new institutions.
Yeah, I was going to get to the new institutions. I don't want to dwell on it because I know you want to mention University of Austin, but I was going to say what you're talking about is ways to what you can do about combating these local injustices or fringe groups. But what do we do about the fact that it's embedded in every major institution of society, from government now to scientific societies to academia? I mean, you can't I can document, and I do. I write pieces saying, "Look what the National Academy of Sciences said. Isn't this ridiculous?" And of course, part of my purpose in that I say one of the things we can do is educate and publicize, but it's hard to know how to go beyond that.
Yeah, so this is a huge I mean, I've been screaming about this since 2013, 2012. I've been almost nobody listened. Now here we are. So okay, all right. Well, I know you don't do jujitsu, but it's a little bit like a rear naked choke when someone is choking you out and you're about ready to go unconscious, and then you say to your coach, "Hey, if someone has me in a rear naked choke and I'm about to go unconscious, what do I do?" Well, that's the wrong question. The right question is, what should you have done to not put yourself in a rear naked choke? Okay, but right now we're a little bit beyond that because
we're in it.
Yeah, because we're in it. So I think that the way not to do this is to attempt to fix any institutions. I want them to burn. I don't think that any solution is, oh, we got this guy free speech here. No. In fact, if anything, we need to accelerate the decline of the institutions. So
yeah, I mean, that's one attitude. It's an anarchist attitude to some extent.
I wouldn't say it's an anarchist attitude
Well,
at
I
all,
would.
because we're building, and
Well,
it's
you
not,
only if you're
Ralston
building.
College.
So
Yeah,
okay,
well, we are
let's
building.
I wasn't going to spend much time
We are
on.
building.
Okay, so there's a new institution which has been created with the goals of free speech and all of the things we're talking about. University of Austin raised a lot of money. You're involved in it,
Yeah.
and the question, and so
There are many others, not just me.
I know,
Hayan,
but I'm talking.
Herciali,
I know. I've talked to Hayan, but I'm talking to you now, so you're involved in it. So and so look, I wrote Hayan early on and said, hey, this is great. What can I do to help? If I think it's important to create institutions. I happen to not think that that it's in any way going to it's going to replace Harvard or Stanford or Princeton or any of those places, certainly not in the present time, and nor I don't see a path for that. But I'm
almost positive you're wrong, and I place a very high degree of confidence in that.
Okay. It's great to have an alternative, or a seeming alternative. However, the really good scholars
and
the really good scholars at the institutions I've just named are working for open, for truth, free speech, understanding, pushing progress, pushing the limits of knowledge forward. The people, I know a lot of people at these institutions that I criticize, but the scholars that I know at them are all on board with what we're talking about, because that's how they become successful scientists, and therefore there's a lot of work going on at those institutions, real research that is productive and good, and moreover, the question is how. So University of Austin's raised a lot of money. It's got people like you and other people coming in, not no one living in Austin, but coming in to give talks there, spend 2 weeks and give a seminar. That's not a university, however.
Correct.
Yeah, and unless people move with their feet, which means leaving their highly paid, cushy positions at elite universities, where they are able, for the most part, to do what they want to do, and they just ignore the nonsense around them, then it's not then you're not gonna create an alternative institution.
Go ahead. I interrupted.
No, I'm being
so much in the conversation.
I'm being provocative here and devil's advocate. I want you to respond.
Yeah, there's so much in the conversation, and I still have things from the other question you asked me, resident in the back of my mind, taking up some bandwidth. But okay, just last week, 2 people from Ivy League institutions, Joshua was not one of them, called me, and one was from Ivy and the other one was from near Ivy, called me and said, hey, how can I be involved in this? These people I've known for years, or at least one of them I've known for years. Right after the school was announced on Barry Weiss's Substack, they got thousands of applications from tenured faculties from lead institutions. I got hundreds myself, and I'm not even in the administration. There was no advertised position. There was nothing. They've raised over $100 million, 550 acres of land. There's a clear need. People want this. People are sick of the shit that's going on. They don't want to, they just want something new. And I just want to be crystal clear. I think Ralston College is Stephen Blackwood's institution. There are other institutions that are coming up.
Yeah.
And I think all of those together, it's not just like there's University of Austin. I think all of those together are only a good thing for the educational landscape. You're right. So just think, this is
1,000 points of light, no doubt about it. And
this has been in 1 year. 1 year, 100 million, 550 acres. Just think a year ago they started this. A year ago, I was with the president, having drinks with them. And so we just did the Forbidden Courses program, and these kids were amazing. I published something on my Substack about an article. Every one of these kids, incredibly smart, the elite of the elite of the elite, but not just, and it was a completely merit-based system, no exogenous characters. Boom. What is your merit? And then they looked at that, can you write, what essays, etc. Race was not a consideration. Gender was not a consideration. Sexual orientation. None of the things that shouldn't be considerations were considerations. and it was a remarkable, an extraordinary experience. Neil Ferguson taught there. Our mutual friend
Yeah.
Ian taught there. Well,
You see, I think I'm sure it was a great experience, and I view it as a fantastic summer school. It's a
well,
fantastic summer
it
school
was a
educational
kind of a
experience, and
okay.
it'll be interesting to see. It'll
Yeah.
be interesting to see, and I hope it flourishes, and I do think 1,000 points of light. I mean, I became involved in a college in London, which was their first liberal arts college, because it was it was a small school that was going to be based on Socratic method, and moreover, all of the humanities students had to listen to scientists like me talk about the scientific method. And I thought, well, this is a great example to do it. So I think lots of different examples are good. I just,
Right. Agreed.
I suspect it's not, it'll be, it will be interesting to see if it change, because eventually you see the problem is once it becomes a university, there's going to have to be tenure and promotion decisions. There's going to have to be HR departments.
I don't think there's going to be tenure.
Okay. And that'll be an interesting thing to see if it changes. If higher education can function without tenure, will be an interesting thing to see.
Yeah, 6 months ago, or maybe 5 months ago, I was in a meeting with a bunch of other people, Glenn Lowry, a bunch of people there,
Yeah.
public folks and non-public folks, and we discussed, okay, so we're building an institution from nothing. What do we do? What are the entrance requirements? Do we have SATs? Do we have writing samples? Is there promotion? How do we promote? Do we promote? Is there tenure? Are we going to have a basketball court? Are we going to have a wrestling arena? Like so we're literally building this from scratch, but to use a phrase I'm sure you're familiar with, we're building it off of the shoulders of giants. So we're looking at what's worked, what's effective, and how do we make sure that commitment to truth and free speech is there. So 2024, the institution will be going online, not online, up and running, so shall we say.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. Class. I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on it. Look, I think, as I say, I've applauded it the minute I saw it. I talked to Ian and others and you, and I'm all in favor of the goals. But I'm not sure I'm in favor of destroying the existing stuff. But that's the difference.
Well, but that's the other thing. That's the other thing. You don't. It's not binary. You don't have to do that. I said that because, okay, so I don't really care what the old institutions, the legacy institutions do. I just don't care. And I also at this point, I just don't care about any criticism of these things. I'm building something.
Sure.
Somebody else can sit and bemoan and criticize all they want. You can try to fix a system that's clearly broken. That time would be far better invested, not trying to do that, but coming on board and building new things, making something meaningful, making something worthwhile, that from the get-go, it is committed to truth.
Yeah, but okay, I agree. I agree with you completely. As a philosopher, I think it's important. As a young physicist, I'd say what you want to do is do the best physics you can do, and there are clear places to go and do it, and because you can isolate yourself to some extent, no longer because of a lot of the rules that are being developed, but you want to do the best research you can do, and
Correct.
Teaching is a part of it, and that should be your goal as a young scientist. Go where you can do the best science, and by the way, interestingly enough, which is amazing to me, but and I wrote about this a while ago. There's an example, at least I know of one young scientist from Australia who went to China, which is not exactly a place for free speech and enlightenment, but said, "Hey, I'm able to do my science much better here because in the laboratories, they don't worry about all these other, woke issues. So yeah, it's a dictatorship. But hey, I can do better science here." So it's an
they have different heresies over there.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. Well, look, I wanted to have that discussion, but it took time from other things I wanted to talk to you about. So we're going to go a little longer than I planned. But I want to now move. So we covered most of what I wanted to do in that regard. But now I want to quickly, all things reconsidered. What is that?
Okay. So did you used to listen to NPR?
Of course, all things considered. Yeah, no, I listen to NPR, and I was on it a lot. So okay.
Okay.
So back in the old days, I used to do that kind of stuff.
Okay. So, okay. Do you have a moment where you just stopped listening to NPR? Was there just something, or was it a gradual for you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It maybe was gradual, although it was also a moment. I mean, it was just changing lifestyle where I stopped. Yeah, yeah. I guess I stopped. I like listening to music more than talk on the radio, so I started. But I think it was the question of Yeah, I know where you're getting. So why don't you say what
Well,
happened to you?
so the conservatives want to defund NPR.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, I just have to discharge this because it's in my mind. I wanted to say, what should be done about this? When you asked me that question, I just want to get this out because it's just it's interfering with my thinking.
Okay,
The,
sure.
the solution to these problems are not to vote for right-wing
Yeah.
extremists. That's
Yeah.
not the solution. The
Yeah.
solution is not to go to the far right for this. The solution is to keep a moral center, and I'm a classical liberal broadly,
Yeah.
and just to come back to those principles without there being an extremist on the
And
other
to
side.
make sure that liberalism is classical liberalism, not
That's
extremist left
that's
stuff. So you
that's
want it,
correct.
yeah.
That's correct. And similarly, the solution to ideological capture of the far left of our academic institutions is not to build a right-wing academic institution. That's actually making the problem worse. Okay, so now back to all things reconsidered.
Okay.
So I don't want NPR defined. I'm not a conservative. I know everybody calls me a Nazi and a conservative and a moron. I'm not
No, I hardly ever call you those things.
Okay, I should have said everyone.
Yeah, anyway, no.
And so I don't want NPR defunded, but I want an NPR that we can trust, that all people can listen to. There's so much disinformation, misinformation, poor journalism. I just want a place. I used to love NPR and I used to donate to NPR, and it's become something horrible. It's ideologically captured. It pushes certain narratives. So I decided to do something about it with the money from my nonprofit, and I have a show called All Things Reconsidered, and it starts with testimonials of people who used to be former listeners to NPR. That's the framing, and then it goes to someone. We have someone who used to work at affiliate stations affiliated with NPR, and she gives a 5 to 10 minute setting something up or explanation of something kind of behind the scenes. It's called Morning Sedition. And then a very good friend of mine who's his book is forthcoming called The Gift of Violence. He's one of the first crop of American jiu-jitsu black belts. He's Conor McGregor's coach's coach. I don't know if that means anything to you, but he and I do an analysis. This is a 5-episode, first series is 5 episode of various NPR stories that are insane, and we talk about them and we analyze them, like here's a question they should have asked, etc. One thing I've learned from doing this, I've listened to hundreds of hours of NPR, so you don't have to. One thing beside the brain damage is that I've listened to is that I've learned is if they want to so they'll interview people, softball questions, it's not data driven, it's almost purely ideological, but they'll always ask somebody on the other side of the aisle what the argument is for their opponents. So they'll ask left-wing woke people what their arguments about guns or walls or immigration or whatever it is, as opposed to actually asking people who believe those things. It's fascinating. And almost invariably they're mischaracterizations. They're caricatures of what people actually believe. And I would like the reform of NPR.
But actually, I have to say you resonate with me, because there's the one NPR program I used to listen to, actually, because I was involved in it, was I used to do a lot of Science Friday, and it used to be it was a great science program, and now it's sort of half the time. Ira Flato. Now it's just like woke half the time, and it's
it's terrible. It's terrible.
Just a real disappointment to me. And
it is. That's what it is. It's a disappointment, and I don't want it defunded. I want it to have some integrity. So that's what we're doing.
Okay, now
go ahead.
Now I want to move from the sublime to the ridiculous, or actually from the ridiculous to the sublime. Is actually truly. I want to talk about 2 bits of philosophy to end this.
Okay.
One, I want to give you a chance now to really demonstrate how wrong you are. Anyway, let's talk about life elsewhere in the universe.
Okay.
I promise you. I promise you. And I know we've had this conversation.
So we have had this conversation many times. And what was the second thing you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I want to talk about some classical philosophy. I want to talk about infinite regress. I want to end this conversation on a really high note, which is really a philosophical we began a little bit with philosophy. I want to end with philosophy. So that's
Okay.
those are the two things we're going to do.
All right. That sounds good. So, as you know, we've had this conversation. I actually think we had this conversation in the airport, in Portland as well.
Yeah.
I am a little self-conscious. I had this conversation with Brian Keating, our mutual friend, a little while ago. I'm a little self-conscious because, okay, but I'll throw out there. I don't think there's intelligent life. I don't think there's intelligent life, and I absolutely don't think there's intelligent spacefaring life anywhere in the universe. I don't even think there's another celled organism anywhere.
Yeah, I know. And that's a perfectly reasonable postulate.
Is it really? Wow, I'm surprised that you said that's reasonable. Okay.
Well, no. I mean, it's a priori we don't have any knowledge one way or another. So the question is, what arguments do you have to support it? I point out once again that we're going to stop looking for intelligence anymore, because SETI's going to stop looking for intelligence because it's now a white supremacist concept. But so we may not know the answer. But what I would argue, I would argue that I think it's a reasonable presumption. I think it's false. I think it's likely to be false. I can't say it's false. But what are your arguments?
Well, let me say, so if and I'm just, maybe this is cheating, but I'm going back from a previous conversation. You say it's false because you think the distances are so great. Is that the bottom line?
Oh, I mean, why? You mean you think it's false because we haven't heard from anyone? Is that what you're saying?
Well, the Fermi paradox, yeah. And
well, hold on, but let's step back. For people who may not have heard the Fermi paradox, Fermi paradox basically, he said, if they're out there, how come they haven't visited us or know about it?
Yeah, where is everybody?
Because if you actually took the time it takes to, potentially visit another planet, colonize, and then move on. And if your sole purpose in life was colonizing the galaxy, it could have been, he argued, one could imagine it could have been colonized by now, and therefore we should see it everywhere.
Correct.
Anyway, so go on. Sorry, I'm getting in focus here. Okay.
No, so is your question to me, what is my evidence for this belief?
Well, yeah. What's your evidence for this belief? Because
I guess if I may ask you to ask me a previous question, or I'll just state it. What is my confidence in the belief? My confidence is over 50%, but not very much.
Oh, so that's appropriate.
Yeah.
I mean, let me say at the beginning that any statement about life elsewhere in the universe is a statement without evidence one way or another. It's a presumption based on very little, obviously no empirical evidence, except for the fact that we haven't heard anyone yet or seen anyone yet.
Right. So you're making inferences from the Drake equation, and you're filling those in with conservative estimates, and
I've said the Drake equation isn't an equation; it's just a list of things you're ignorant of.
Right.
But it's a good list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good list, and even with the most conservative predictions. I was going to publish a paper a year ago, write a paper. I don't know if
you asked me about it. I think about
whether or not. Yeah, whether or not that each stage of the Drake equation, or you could look at new constants that have been added as cultural variables at the time. When we were concerned about killing ourselves, that becomes a variable, and then you can kind of mark, so that's really a marker for where we are in our society culturally at the time, what the variables in the Drake equation would be. Anyway,
but you asked me, why. Well, let me respond to your question, and then you can respond back. But I mean, if you're asking me, there's lots of reasons I would think that you wouldn't have heard. I mean, the Fermi paradox is not a problem for me. There are lots of ways. I mean, civilizations may not survive. The universe is a big place. Sure. Intelligent civilizations have no real need to communicate if they become, and also there's no need to. I mean, my other argument is you could use the Fermi paradox to ask why the world wasn't colonized way before it was. If you asked, how quickly could humans have propagated over the entire world? My bet is if you just use the laws of physics, you'd find out it was much quicker than it actually happened. Because the point is, I think people don't like to leave where they are until where they are is pretty miserable. And then they're motivated, and so they can spend a fair amount of time in a nice place. But the basic argument is, if I step back and look at the probabilities and say, life evolved on Earth about as soon as the laws of physics allowed it to. What life required was organic materials, sunlight, water, those are ubiquitous everywhere we look. There are 100 billion stars or so in our galaxy, 100 billion solar systems, 100 billion galaxies. And so unless there's some good evidence and some good argument for why we shouldn't be typical, and there may be.
Yeah, there may be. That's the other variable. Yeah, there may be.
And I will accept there may be. There are lots of precursors, lots of things that had they been different, we wouldn't have evolved. But unless someone could give me a definitive argument for why we are not typical, then my assumption is we are. That's all. But it's not based on anything.
Okay.
Other than
So that's reasonable, and it would seem again. Okay. Well, the first is Carl Sagan's comment. We could have been the first. There's no way to know that either.
Yeah.
But we've seen nothing. We've seen SETI has picked up nothing. There's been no von Neumann probes, and you would think that there'd be at least some von Neumann probes. You would think that you would have seen some. I don't know what it would be.
It is a big place, and it's hard to find. It's really hard to find. Look, I'll give you the argument I gave in the physics of Star Trek, which I think I gave there the first time years ago, and you may have read it, but obviously it didn't influence you. So you gotta, if you're listening, what are you listening for? I gave up watching TV a long time ago, but one of the reasons why, I watch online stuff, but regular TV. One of the reasons was there were 200 channels. I never found what I was looking for. But
I'll give you a list of stuff to watch. You should watch Devs on Netflix.
Yeah, no, Devs.
We'll talk about that later.
This week, by the way, in my podcast, as we're speaking, which will now date this, you can listen to my podcast. I'm talking to Alex Garland, the writer and director of Devs. So listen to the podcast. It's out just now. But anyway, there's lots of good stuff to watch, but you can always find another way to watch it. But what I'm saying is that commercial TV, I stopped watching because it was just hard to find what I wanted. And by the time I found it, the program was over.
I'll give you a list, but back to the
but also, so in the real universe is, an infinite number of frequencies to you have to figure out what you're going to do. And then, and then there's, then you have to figure out what signal you're going to give, and
all those things are reasons that I'm not higher than like 51% or what have you. All those are all counterexamples or reasons why my belief could be disconfirmed. I remember at the end of the conclusion of our last conversation, you shrugged your shoulders and was like, "Yeah, you could be right. Maybe, I don't know." I mean, I think that's the thing. We don't really know. I have long speculated. Now, this is maybe this will make me sound like a kook, but I have long speculated that the very model we're using of the universe is not accurate. So I even think thinking in those terms is not correct. I have absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. I have, reasons that I've speculated about that I could attempt to articulate. But it would seem, and again, I'm not a physicist, it would seem that there would be something and we have nothing. And what is the reason we have nothing? Well, a reasonable person could infer from that because we're alone.
That's one possibility. And
so
lots
then,
of, but Carl Sagan also said another favorite quote, which probably didn't originate with him, but you know the quote maybe: "Absence of evidence isn't evidence for absence." And so there are lots of plausible reasons why simple things like it's hard for signals to propagate across the galaxy in certain bandwidths that we can detect on Earth. We're just beginning.
Correct.
Process of listening. We're just beginning. And as a colleague of mine, in fact, I had a podcast with him who's saying, no, you don't want to listen. You want to look for optical signals. And so we may be all of the work so far have been in the wrong domain. If you're actually rational, correct, you'll really want to have, like a flashlight and turn on and off. And so, I would,
and there are eminent scientists like Avi Loeb, I know you disagree with him, but who believe that there is a high likelihood of visitation.
I'd say that's a set of measure one. Avi Loeb.
Yeah, right.
But anyway.
Yeah. So I just want to throw that out there because it's been something I've been thinking about since childhood. And there's certainly no necessity in it. I think we both agree to that. But anyway, I
Well,
just wanted to.
the good news
Go ahead.
is that we're going to, I mean, the really good news for me is that we're entering an age where we'll at least have some more empirical data, because all of this talk is just talk, and
Correct.
that's a part of the Drake equation. It's fun to think about, but we don't know anything. And as I've argued, a lot of people talk about habitable planets. When someone says a planet is habitable, it doesn't mean it's habitable. And a lot of astrobiology is a field where there's lots of talk and not a lot more talk than there is
Yeah,
than there is evidence. But
and people do that. They ascribe higher confidence values to their speculations.
yeah, and so we certainly should be skeptical, and I think and obviously you are, and one should be. The but I think the fundamental point is that we're going to have we have new tools, JWST and other things. We are going to be able to look at the atmospheres of planets. We'll get evidence. I think. I mean, it would be shocking to me if there wasn't evidence for life elsewhere, but microbial life, plant life. I mean, it's just hard to imagine how you could have a root that didn't
Yeah,
produce that.
yeah,
And,
and the well, either we're the first, or as my speculation, I think our models are wrong. So there's something fundamentally off, like
well,
we're really brains in vats or in a simulation, or there's just
okay,
something we can't even fathom.
okay. Well, that's always a possibility, but it's unlikely.
Well,
But
that's the thing, is how do you ascribe likelihood to any of these? Like,
because
that's
well,
part of the problem.
I mean, the point is, if there's no evidence whatsoever for it, it's
Yeah.
probably not likely.
Well, there's no evidence for any of this stuff.
well, you can ask them, but look, let's actually this is a beautiful segue to the last topic.
Oh,
The
okay.
problem with the matrix theory that you have is the very thing that people miss about it. So we're in a simulation. Are the people who developed the simulation, are they in someone else's
Oh, yes.
simulation? Is there
Yeah.
infinite regress? So let's talk about infinite regress. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
problem, because if they're not in a simulation and they're more complex than us, then why would we assume that we couldn't arise naturally and not be in a simulation? So
Yeah, and just before we go to that, the idea would be you would then, so if you're trying to figure out if you're in a simulation, then you would build a simulation and see if the creatures in the simulation could figure out how they figured out if they're in a simulation. You just run that billions and trillions of times in tandem, and then you could do some cool stuff like technology mine your simulations, but you would then see how they figured it out and see if you could use that tool to figure it out. And it's, if only, and then maybe they get the idea, one of your many simulations, and they do the same thing, and then so it's simulations all the way down. But the idea of turtles all the way down comes from broadly from Hinduism. People have written about it. History of philosophy.
Yeah.
Fichte wrote about in 1794, etc. It comes up. The infinite regress problem is fascinating. Our mutual friend, I think about him quite a bit. He was kind of a mentor to me, Victor Stenger. Vic and I had this used to converse about this at length, and I know that you both disagreed with each other, but I do want you to know that he always spoke fondly about you.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Fondly
Well,
yeah,
I disagree with people I admire, so it's okay.
yeah,
It
he really
ways.
liked you. But so
That's
it's
nice.
taken as, so there's the epistemic regress in philosophy, which I don't really want to talk about, but I'm talking about the kind of the metaphysical, or the I think it's an academic superstition, this idea that there can't be an infinite regress or turtles all the way down. So Stenger in God and the Multiverse talks about this. Infinities all the way back, infinities all the way forward. But it's taken as a truism among academic philosophers that you cannot have an infinite regress, and it's always struck me as bizarre. I've always heard that without an argument, and then every time I've asked anybody, even people who work in that, they've looked at me like I'm insane. Like, it's just a given that you have to. Hume talks about that a lot, and Christians. You debated one of the Christians, William Lane Craig. He talks about, I think it's Valenkin, who talks about the Big Bang, et cetera, et cetera. Dialogues concerning natural religion is when Hume talks about it. Russell talks about it and Why I'm Not a Christian, et cetera. But there's no not only is there no reason. I know you might disagree with Stenger on the physics on this, but let me give it in its most humble form. There's no reason to believe that there can't be an infinite regress.
Yeah, see, this is the problem with philosophy.
Exactly.
You can't. I mean, to assume that, it's just basis. okay, let's look for examples or possibilities of it. But to assume that I've often said, in fact, I've probably said it with Lane Craig, is that common sense doesn't mean anything. The world doesn't care if it makes sense to you.
Correct.
The world is the way it is. And so lots of things don't make sense. Quantum mechanics doesn't make sense. You may not like it, but it exists. And so, in fact, Sheng was probably wrong about, well, I think he had some misconception about cosmology, but an infinite future seems to be likely. Potentially, if you wait long enough, an uncountable number of universes might be possible. And I like my favorite form of infinite regress, if you wish, which still is a plausible, was Feynman's. Is there a theory of everything? There may not be a theory of everything.
Yeah, so
as you said, nature could be like an onion, and all you do is peel another layer and another layer and another layer, and it could go on forever, and that's fine. That doesn't mean it like Sisyphus. We should be smiling, as Kemi would say, because sure, maybe we'll never know everything, but each time we peel back a layer, hey, how satisfying is that to have revealed a hidden layer of reality?
Right. And so that, I think, is part of the problem. In physics, you seek a unified field theory. There may not be
there may not be.
Right. There may not be a unified field theory. There may not be a way to wed the realm of the very small into that's the other problem with
quantum mechanics and gravity. There's
exactly.
That's but we keep working. The point is, we just keep working to see. And the answer is, we'll never know by just thinking about it or by talking about it. We just got to work on it and see if we can, because nature is going to be the ultimate arbiter of these things, not philosophers or
and it's amazing how many philosophers, and that's I think what happens when you get in a community of people who don't understand the role evidence ought to play in belief formation. They don't understand. They haven't been trained to think like a scientist. They've been trained to think like philosophers. I think that is perilous to us all.
Well, you're right. I think that it is perilous to us all, and people call it scientism, but I don't.
I don't either.
We all have to. The science is a process, not a discipline, and the scientific method is a process, and it's one that has to permeate all of society. Because all it is asking questions, looking for evidence, and testing and retesting. And that should be the basis of public policy, of our lives
100%.
And our thinking. And it's not elite scientism to say that. It's just an expression of saying, well, if you detach yourself from reality, you're going to come up with bad decisions. Ultimately.
Yeah, I completely agree.
That's a great way for us on such agreement is a great way for us to end this. As usual, it's been an enjoyable conversation, and I hope other people found it as enjoyable as I have. So.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and I'm going to come and visit you up there in Canada.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's much nicer up here. It's Valhalla. It's absolutely.
Oh, I can't wait.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.